Here we are once again, the Shakespeare Stealer. We are on chapter 19. I'll do 19 and 20. So here we go. I considered walking on past the property room and out the rear door. What kept me from it was the thought of Falconer. If I had to answer to someone, I preferred that it be the person least likely to cut my throat. I halted before the property room door, like a condemned man at the foot of the gallows. Mr. Hemminger sat within at a table, writing figures in a ledger. He looked up and beckoned to me. "Come in, Widge. I'm just doing accounts. My least favourite duty, but a necessary one." He sprinkled sand on the fresh ink and blew it off. Closed the ledger. "Now, I understand you were in a bit of trouble last night." My stomach knotted up. "Aye, but it wasn't my own fault." I know that. Thomas gave me a full account." "Thomas? Mr. Pope?" "Oh, how could Mr. Pope have known about my attempted theft? Had he been the one who locked me in the room? This is a serious problem, but not an unusual one." "It's not?" "No. In fact, several of our apprentices have done the same." "Truly? What did you do to them?" Do to them?" Now it was Mr. Hemminger's turn to sound bewildered. "Were they not punished?" Mr. Hemminger's laughed. "For running off from the masters? If we took only those boys whose masters have agreed to hand them over, we'd be rather short on apprentices. Most would soon hand them over to the devil." It came to me then, almost too late, that we were talking of two entirely different matters. I was concerned with what I'd actually done, and he with the lie I'd concocted to cover it. I hastened to scramble out of the hole I'd dug for myself. I shook my head glumly. My master seemed bent on having me back. "This is England, not China. A man has the right to choose his own path. If you truly wish to stay on here and prove yourself able, we will stand with you. If your master comes for you, we will offer him the usual fee to buy off your obligation, and he may take or leave it, but we'll see that he leaves you. In any case, does that suit you?" I nodded, so taken aback by this offer of kindness, where I had looked for wrath, that I could scarcely speak. "Aye, it does indeed." "Good. Go back to lessons then." I turned to go. "Oh, by the by, they tell me you managed to deliver your 3 lines without fainting yesterday. We'll have to try you with 4, 5 next time, eh?" "I don't ken, sir. I'm not sure I could bear it." He laughed, taking this for a jest, and I let him. "One more thing, Widge. I fancied all morning that I smelled something rotten, as Mr. Shakespeare says, but my nose isn't what it was. Do you smell anything?" I did indeed, but it took me a moment to recall what it was. The helmet I had used as a chamber pot. I felt my face go red. "A dead rat, most like," I said, and quickly turned away. For the second time that day I had been made to feel that I was among people who cared about me and my welfare. My guilt at the thought of betraying him and the rest of the company came back, stronger than ever. They would stand with me, Mr. Hemminger had said. But he said it without knowing the true source of my troubles. If anyone came after me, it would not be Dr. Bright nor my current master, Simon Buss, who might be willing to listen to reason. It would be the formidable and unreasonable falconer. I did not wish to endanger anyone in the company, yet my only means of keeping Falconer at bay was to stick close to Mr. Pope's or to the theatre, where Falconer seems reluctant to set foot. For the next week I saw no sign of the dread hooded figure, but this time I did not fool myself into thinking that he had gone away. I kept a vigilant watch, sometimes rising in the small hours of the night to gaze out at the moonlit lanes and hedgerows. "Widge," Sandra said one day on our way to the Globe, "we're friends, aren't we?" "Aye," I said, and felt I spoke the truth. "Then will you tell me, please, why you always glance about so nervously? You look like a dicky bird in a yard full of cats, as Mr. Pope would say." "It's not. I'm not used to the city yet, that's all." There was some truth in that too, but it was also true that I no longer found the landscape of the church spires and grimy tenements so strange. London's speech no longer felt so foreign on my ear or on my tongue, and I'd learned to ignore the clamour of its streets. "You know, 5 minutes' walk in that direction," he pointed south, "brings you into the country, and tomorrow is our idle day." The prospect of an afternoon in the fields and woods was tempting, until I thought of Falconer. "I don't suppose you care to come along?" "I don't mind. I've nothing against the country." To my relief, Julian agreed to join us. The larger the company, the safer I would be. I stopped short of inviting Nick, though, not that he would have gone anyway. It was obvious that he no longer considered himself apprentice. He avoided our company, preferring to spend his time with drinking companions, mostly hired men from the less reputable theatre companies. When forced to rub elbows with us boys, he put on superior airs. That morning, during fencing instruction, Mr. Armand and Mr. Phillips were wanted downstairs, and Nick interpreted this to mean that he was in charge. "All right, now, line up here and let's see what sort of scrimers you are." "Take a walk in the Thames," Julian told him, and turned away. Nick stepped in front of him. I said, "We'll see what you've learned. Would you prefer to demonstrate against the wall or against me?" Julian considered a moment. "Well, I'd say the wall has more wits." "It's too bad you're not as quick with your sword as with your tongue. I think you've all been playing at girls too long. That's what you look like with your mincing steps and your polite little cuts and thrusts. And you," he gave Julian's stick a blow with his own, "you're the worst of the lot. You'd best stick to dancing." Julian's face, always pale, had gone white, and his eyes narrowed. "I'll dance on your grave, you sot," he said, and came on guard. Nick smiled nastily, as though this was what he had been waiting for. He brought his stick to highward, seeming to invite a thrust from Julian. When it came, he stepped aside and struck Julian on the collarbone. Julian staggered, his face drawn with pain. Nick stood calmly waiting for the next move. Julian feigned another stoccata, then performed one of the passatas we had practiced so interminably. His stick caught Nick beneath the breastbone. He let out a grunt of surprise and pain. His mood changed suddenly. He set upon Julian like a Tom of Bedlam, striking edge blows, downright blows, blows which had no name. "You'll hurt him," I shouted, and flung my stick at Nick's legs. It served only to anger him more. "Do something," I told Sandra. Sandra stepped forward with his stick raised. "Nick, stop now." He might as well have told the wall to stop standing there. Being small, I had never been one to solve a problem by a physical attack. I preferred to talk my way out of things, or to perform Cobb's traverse, that is, to run. But Nick would not listen to reason, and running would only leave Julian to his fate. He had rescued me, and now he needed my help. My fencing skills were no match for Nick's, so I fell back on the method of defense that every child of the orphanage learns. catch as catch can wrestling. I at least had the advantage of surprise. I threw myself at Nick's legs and all his weight collapsed on me. The first principle of wrestling is to hang on to your opponent, come what may. So I clung to Nick's breeches like a leech, though he kicked madly and pummeled my back with his fists. I felt his struggles suddenly grow more desperate and lifted my face to see why. Julian had his stick pressed against Nick's throat bow. The more fiercely Nick struggled and clawed, the more pressure new Julian applied. Yet Nick refused to yield. "That will do," a voice rang out. "Let him up." Julian cautiously removed the stick and I had disentangled myself. Mr. Almond stood scowling at us, but under the mask of disapproval I detected a hint of amusement. I wondered how long he had stood observing before he interfered. He offered a hand to Nick, who ignored it and got unsteadily to his feet, rubbing his windpipe and glaring at us like some trapped and wounded beast. "If you're quite done trying to kill one another," Mr. Almond said, "we'll continue with our lessons." "Not you, Nick," he added, as Nick retrieved his single stick. "They'll be wanting you downstairs to rehearse love's labours." "What part?" Nick growled, his voice sounding choked and weak. "Dumas." Nick stared at him. "A man's part? Do you imagine you can pass for a girl with that voice? It sounds as though Julian squeezed the last drop of sweetness from it." Certainly there was no sweetness in the glance Nick threw us as he left the room. "If Nick is to take on men's roles," Mr. Almond said, "that will change things for you boys as well. Sander, you and Julian will begin studying Nick's old roles, which you'll be given some of Sander's duties and his smaller parts. Can you manage that?" "Yes, sir." I tried to sound confident. His raised eyebrows. "What happened to you?" "I'm trying to civilize my speech." "My speech?" He nodded thoughtfully. "A pity, though. Soon you'll sound the same as all the rest of us." As we returned to our lessons, Julian said, "That was a brave thing you did." I shrugged. "You were no coward yourself. I was afeard you'd throttle him. It'd be no more than he deserves." "That's so. Saying we fight like girls. I dare say A's never had a girl do such as that to him." Julian gave me a curious look and seemed about to say something, but Mr. Almond interrupted. "We're not doing voice lessons, you two. Lay on." Our country outing next day was more in the nature of a rehearsal at first. Sander and Julian brought along the sides they needed in order to learn Nick's old roles. The brief bits I inherited were not worth the bother of a separate side. I merely jotted them down as Sander recited them. Without thinking, I wrote them in Dr. Bright's charactery. Julian peered over my shoulder. "What sort of writing is that? I thought Mr. Shakespeare's hand was hard to read." "Ah, it's just something of my own invention." I tried to tuck the paper into my wallet, but Sander plucked it from my grasp. "Let me see." He turned the paper this way and that, frowning. "Can you actually read this?" "When it's right side up." I tried to retrieve the paper, but he kept it from me, an easy task, considering our relative heights. No, wait a bit. This is amazing, you know. You can write out anything in this fashion." "Well, no," I lied. "It's rather slow going, in truth." "Slow?" Julian said. "You wrote out those lines as quickly as Sander said them. A trick like that could be really useful. Why, you could copy down the plays of the Lord Admiral's men, word for word." "Steal them?" I said. Julian shrugged. "They do it to us." "That's because our plays are better than theirs," Sander said. "Not much point in our copying their weak stuff, is there?" "I suppose not. All the same, there should be some use for that writing of yours, Widge. You should show it to Mr. Images." "What?" I said, disguising my real dismay with mock dismay, and saddled myself with yet another duty. Sandra laughed. He's right. We'll keep mum about it. Right, Julian? I'm not one to give away others' secrets, Julian said. The day was too fine to spend it all on lines. Goodwife Williamson had packed a cold meal for us, and we chose an inviting spot in the shade of an ancient oak. When I had had my fill, I stretched out and watched the clouds, as I had so often done in the meadows about Berwick. Look at him, Sandra said. He's in his element. We'll have to truss him up and carry him back to the city like a captured deer. I turned my head to make some lazy reply, but it was stopped in my throat by the sight of a dark-clothed figure coming down the road. My face must have reflected my alarm, for Julian said, "What's wrong, Rich?" "Someone's coming," I breathed. And that's the end of chapter 19. Chapter 20. The others turned to see who was approaching. "It's only Mr. Shakespeare," Julian said. I gave a sigh of relief. "Who did you think it was?" "I feared it was me master." "He must be a harsh one for you to fear him so." "Aye, he is that." So pensive and self-absorbed was Mr. Shakespeare that he walked by without even noting our presence. "Should we not at least greet him?" I said. Julian shook his head. "Better not. If he's mulling over some problem at a play, he won't welcome the interruption." "Why is it so glum and gloomy, do you think?" Julian slid closer to me and said confidentially, "I've heard it said he's brooding on a thwarted love affair." Sandra gave him an indignant look. "The man has a wife and 2 daughters in Stratford." Julian grinned. "When did that ever prevent a man from having a love affair?" "You clod. If you want to know what I think it's his son that's the cause of it." "I didn't know he had a son." "He doesn't any longer. The boy grew ill and died while Mr. Shakespeare was here in London. I doubt that he's ever forgiven himself." "Perhaps," I said. "He's simply ruled by melancholy humour." "A what?" said Sandra. "The old master says we're all ruled by the 4 humours, and when we are ill or out of sorts, it's because we ate too much of one. Now, Nick, he's a choleric, hot and dry. Dr. Bright would prescribe something cold and wet to offset it. All the beer he drinks doesn't seem to help much." "Perhaps Julian had it right," I said. "I should take a walk in the Thames." Julian laughed. "What will your master make of me?" "Sanguine, I'd say." "And me?" I considered a moment. "For you, they would have to think up a whole new category." Sandra aimed a good-natured swat at me, which I dodged. He grabbed me, and laughing, we rolled about in the grass like 2 pups. "You're daft, the both of you," Julian said. Then, apparently feeling left out, he pulled up tufts of grass and flung them at us. Sandra spat out a few blades and whispered, "Let's get him." "Aye." We sprang for Julian. He backed up against a tree, calling, "No, no," between fits of laughter. But when we took hold of his arms and tried to drag him down, he turned suddenly serious, indeed angry. "No, I don't want to wrestle." We teased him a moment longer, but he remained stiff and stern, so we left off. For some time afterward, a melancholy humour seemed to rule us as well. A gloominess was cast over our day as though a cloud had come across the sun. But gradually we warmed to one another again and spent several hours poking about a stagnant pond and playing a game at 9 holes with stones, and in other pursuits too trivial to recount. When we heard the bells in Southwark ringing vespers, we were reluctant to return, not just the country boy, I think, but all of us. The week that followed was mostly uneventful. Days which begin with 2 hours of manual labour, proceed to 4 hours of lessons and rehearsals, and conclude with performing in or assisting with a different play each afternoon, can be called uneventful. Compared to the preceding perilous weeks, this was a veritable holiday. I was not locked in any rooms, nor were any daggers held to my throat. I did not wander into any dangerous parts of the city, nor risk my life crossing the Thames. Though I was never quite able to put Falconer out of my mind, I saw no sign of him. Surely, I thought, even he must have given up by now. I did not even quarrel with Nick, for he no longer took lessons with us mere prentices. He still played a few of his old parts, but most of the time he was downstairs rehearsing men's roles. Or at least he was supposed to be. In truth, he was still up to his old tricks, throwing his money away on dice and drink all night long, then coming to rehearsal half drunk, or late, or both. It was as though he had taken on a role he was not prepared to play, not only on stage but in life, and was looking for someone who would tell him what to do next. Yet though he received advice from all quarters, he heeded none of it. Before his second week was out, the part in Love's Labours was given to Chris Beeston, and Nick was back upstairs with us, practising his swordsmanship. What he needs, Julian said, is not fencing lessons, but lessons in manners. Would you like to be the one to learn them to him? I said. Julian rolled his eyes. And you could use a few lessons in grammar. Nick's attitude towards us was even more hostile than before, especially towards Sander, who had taken over several of Nick's roles. With the demotion of Nick to our ranks, the peaceful interlude began to slip away, and my life once more became complicated, filled with anxiety and, finally, danger. The first complication cropped up soon after Nick's return. The moment we arrived at the Globe that morning, we sensed that something was in the air. The sharers were in the property room, discussing some matters so intently that none of them so much as raised a hand to greet us. Halfway through the morning we discovered what the matter was. For a change, Nick was on time for fencing practice, and Mr. Armand was late. When he finally arrived, he beckoned to us, cleared his throat comically, and proclaimed with exaggerated formality, "Oyez, oyez! Be it known that the Lord Chamberlain's men have been asked, or commanded, if you will, to present the play The Tragedy of Hamlet at Whitehall a fortnight from this day." The other prentices looked at one another in surprise. Or was it alarm? "What is Whitehall?" I whispered to Julian. "The royal court." "You mean the palace where the Queen lives?" "No," he said sarcastically, "the royal tennis court, you sot." 2 weeks seemed to me ample time to prepare, but the company behaved as though Judgment Day were almost upon them, and they must put not only their parts, but their entire lives in order. Our property men spent most of their day at the office of the Queen's Master of Revels, preparing elaborate scenery for the great event, so the task of seeing to the properties for the regular performances fell to us prentices. It was not unusual in those next weeks for a player to cry, "Behold!" and open the curtains of the rear alcove to reveal 2 frantic prentices struggling with some unwieldy piece of scenery or furniture. Our tire man, too, deserted us, leaving us to clean our costumes and hold our split seams together as best we might. The principal players, meantime, rehearsed Hamlet endlessly, employing a slightly different version each day, as Mr. Shakespeare deleted or added passages to suit the fancy of the Master of Revels. Even Julian and Sander, who ordinarily took things as they came, seemed to breathe in the air of anxiety that hung about the place. "Why is everyone in such a dither?" I asked Julian. "You've played at the court before, have you not?" "Not I. The company has many times, but this time is different. I don't know quite all that's behind it, but I do know the company has got on Her Majesty's bad side a few months ago by giving a private performance of Richard II for the Earl of Essex." "What's wrong in that?" "The Queen had said that no one should perform the play because it shows a ruler being deposed. I suppose she didn't want it giving anyone any ideas. But apparently that's just what Essex meant to do, for the day after the performance he tried to gather an army to storm the palace. What happened? Julian shrugged. She made him king. He let me puzzle over that a moment and then laughed. He didn't succeed, of course, you ninny. The Queen's Guard threw him in a tower, and a few days later they chopped off his head. Because of the play, the Queen suspected our players of being in league with Essex. They weren't, of course, but they're all walking very carefully now to avoid treading on the Queen's toes. I can see why, I said. If Essex was the Queen's favourite and she topped his costed off, who kens what she might do to someone she doesn't care for? Julian nodded soberly, as though contemplating what dreadful fate the Queen might devise if she were truly displeased. Our lessons were all but suspended for a time, but Mr. Armand insisted on an hour's fencing practice each day. We worked frequently with blunted rapiers and protective plates. We were even permitted one day to strap on a bag of sheep's blood, which gave an added lustre to our mock death throes. Nick and Julian were again paired. Julian wore the protective plate and the bladder of blood. Nick wielded a blunted rapier. He was having trouble piercing the blood bag with the dull point, and growing angry, he thrust harder than was necessary, and without the necessary control. His point struck the bag high, and deflected by the metal plate, caught Julian squarely in the centre of the chest. Julian gave a sharp gasp and went down on one knee, holding his chest and biting his lip against the pain. Sander laughed, obviously thinking it was all a sham. Good acting. He's not acting. Mr. Armand strode over to Julian. What is it? What's happened? Nick stood white-faced, his sword hanging at his side. It was an accident. I struck him. Mr. Armand supported Julian with one arm and helped him sit on the floor. Let me see, he said, and began unhooking the front of Julian's doublet. No, Julian protested. It's nothing. But his strained voice and drawn face gave the lie to this. I'll decide that, Mr. Armand said. I didn't mean to do it, Nick put in sullenly. When Mr. Armand ignored him, he turned away and began pacing irritably back and forth. Mr. Armand tried to pull open the doublet, but Julian pushed his hand away and struggled to rise. I'm all right, I tell you. Stop fighting me. This is not time for false pride or false courage. When Mr. Armand yanked the doublet open, I could see the red stain in Julian's linen shirt. You see, you're bleeding. He drew out the kerchief from his sleeve. Please, Julian begged, pulling at the gaping front of his doublet. I'll see to it myself. Yes, and bleed to death by yourself, most like. Mr. Armand forced Julian's hands away and pulled at the neck of the shirt, laying Julian's torso bare. In truth, though, it was not bare. A cloth was wound tightly about his chest. What is this? Mr. Armand demanded. Then his puzzled scowl transformed into a look of disbelief. The devil take me, he breathed. Julian was fairly frantic now, clutching at the front of his shirt while tears streamed down his cheeks. Let me alone, please let me alone. Mr. Armand recovered and shook his head. We have to stop the bleeding. Just let me put this on the wound and you can hold it in place, all right? Julian nodded shortly and turned his head aside in an attempt to hide his tears. Sharing his embarrassment, we hung our heads and moved back a few paces. Come now, Mr. Armand lifted Julian's slight body easily in his arms. We'll get you downstairs where you can lie down, and then we'll find someone who can bandage that properly. But why? Nick started to ask. Mr. Armand shot him a warning glance and carried Julian from the room. When they were gone, Nick said, Why can't he bandage it himself? Surely it's not so bad as to require a doctor. Though from the way the boy carried on, you'd think I'd gutted him. It couldn't be that bad, could it? I glanced at Sander and knew from the stunned look on his face that, like me, he had guessed the truth, that Nick was either too slow-witted or too unobservant to see. "I don't believe the wound is what concerns Mr. Armand or Julian," Saunders said. "What then?" Saunders looked to me and shrugged. "It may as well be said. It'll be no secret soon." I shook my head. "I'll not be the one to tell it." "Tell what?" Nick demanded. Saunders gave a sigh of resignation. "It would seem," he said, "that Julian is a girl." And that is the end of chapter 20. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.